As I was beginning my ethnohistoric research, I, of course, was very dependent on the people who had come before me. And so if I'm going to respond to the books that most marked my development in history and the research that I was doing, I would have to start with my professor Bill Dunning's book entitled Social and Economic Changes Among the Northern Ojibwa, his study of Pikangikum, because it was very much in the tradition of British social anthropology, something that, of course, I had been trained in by both my studies at UBC and at Toronto. And as a result, I discovered that one can view the native populations very much as the British social anthropologists did, in a kind of structural, functional way. And so that resonated with me. And so that was the first book that really started organizing my thoughts. But more specifically, I was very much appreciative of the work that Ed Rogers had done both in Quebec and in Ontario on his work on the Algonquians, because of course then I started really learning the details of life on the land. Richard Preston, by 1975, I think, had published his Cree narratives, and it introduced me certainly to the religio-philosophical thinking of the Crees, and helped inform my approach to ethnohistory and how I was going to interpret what I was reading in the Hudson's Bay Company archives. And fortunately, before I finished my work, Adrian Tanner came out with his Bringing Home Animals, and I learned an enormous amount about life in the bush. Again, certainly not available to me through the Hudson's Bay archives, because they really only talked about the Cree population when they came to the post. And if I'm asked to comment, as I am, about the great intellectual debates, well, certainly James Bay had its own intellectual debate, and that was the whole family hunting territory system that had first been referred to by Frank Speck, who was a diffusionist. He was roaming, no, that's not fair. He was traveling through certainly Ontario and Quebec, looking for certain traits that he's found in common, as was the sort of the Boasian school as opposed to the evolutionist school that was still current at the time. And I don't think he really intended to start off a debate, but he mentioned in 1915 in passing he was really looking at hunting group formation. But in 1915 he mentioned the people had, individual families had a family hunting territory. And that sat in the published literature until 1932, when Diamond Jeunesse, who was then head of the Museum of Man, refuted this, said it was impossible for primitive people to have a concept of private property. Well, certainly this conflict came to its head in the early 1950s when Eleanor Leacock published her PhD thesis in 1954 in The American Anthropologist as a memoir, so that it gained wide distribution. And she countered on the same basis as Jeunesse that it was impossible for an egalitarian society to have an equal distribution of sort of the wealth or property. And this didn't happen until the coming of the fur trade. And only capitalism introduced this unequal distribution of property. And so that sat, and again, for many years, because it was taken up by a number of anthropologists, and everybody basically ascribed to Leacock's finding. She was working amongst the Montagnais, who really were in the winter went far north to hunt the caribou, and in the summer came back to fishing, and were not as dependent on the beaver as were the Crees. Well, when Adrian Tanner and Harvey Feit started doing their research at Mistassini and at Wasponipee, respectively, they were able to chart exactly how these family hunting territories were used. They were able to show the coherence, the efficaciousness, the effectiveness, I should say, of them. And gradually the the anthropological world has started also leaving behind this whole notion of primitive communism that both Eleanor Leacock, supported by Richard Lee, were promoting in the 1960s and 1970s. My contribution to this family hunting territory debate goes back to the my work in the archives and my discoverings. I remember sitting one night in the microfilm room, and I was by myself. It was a Thursday evening. I remember it very strikingly. As I'm reading the East Main records of 1745, I come across a trader reporting that the Indians counted a trespass to hunt upon one another's liberty, as they say. And I went, wow, trespass? They're discussing trespass? This has to show how old certainly the family hunting territories were. Never able to say, as Harvey Fite has suspected, that they were Aboriginal. They were, but given the fact that it makes good sense to be able to predict where the beaver are, that to be able to practice a form of conservation, that you go back to the same property, the same area every year to hunt it. And of course, the hunting territories were vast. So this was the great intellectual debate that one became a part of in our writings. Certainly, Richard Lee did back down in the in the early, not till the early 90s, in his writings on the San, when others had accused him of ignoring the fact that the San people were pristine, and therefore had not were living a life that they had for hundreds, if not might have said thousands of years. He backed down when he went back into the records and discovered that they had been ranchers in the late 1800s, and they'd been in contact with many other peoples. And I suppose this is a good time to remind you that that when I was defending my thesis, that Richard Lee wanted to know why I was studying Sullied peoples. He obviously had felt that he was studying a pristine people, and of course his whole Man the Hunter studies were based on that premise. So so then I ended up at McGill, I guess I should say, after I completed my my thesis, and I first came in as a postdoctoral fellow to the Arctic Institute. By that time it had changed its name, but which I've quite forgotten as to what we called it after the Arctic Institute, which moved out to Calgary, and the government, the provincial government, Quebec government, stopped funding institutes. No, they did fund this institute that we held. Sorry, I just cannot recall the name of it, and it's really not important. But because we had an institute going that had been the subsequent to the Arctic Institute, which had moved to Calgary and had moved its library, it was a dropping off place for people on their way north. In those days, Montreal was the airport that was used to take flights throughout the north, and so people stopped either on their way there or on their way back, and we had seminars every week. It was a very rich time for me to hear about what was going on in the north, and to, of course, make contact with people working both amongst the Cree population and amongst the Inuit population. In terms of my teaching then, I was teaching some informal seminars, and when I was hired at McGill some years later, first on a program that was Canada Research Fellow, where I was required to teach only 2 classes and continue my research, was lovely. It then turned into a full-time teaching post. So I started off with smaller classes in terms of, I'm talking about my pedagogy now, and then I ran them in seminars, remembering how much I had learned especially at UBC in seminars, and how important it was for the students to learn to start speaking out, and that how much better they would remember the materials if they had to defend their positions. Even when the classes became large, say 60 or 70 people, I devised this manner of teaching one time per week. So we had classes of an hour and a half, and then I would meet the students. I would break the students up into 3 classes, seminar groups, and I would meet with each of them separately. So again, they had an opportunity to discuss the material, because certainly in ethnohistory there were a lot of issues that one had to deal with, because of course we were surmising a fair amount from the records, whether it was the Hudson's Bay records or the government records. When the classes got even larger, when I was teaching introductory anthropology, I was teaching classes the size of 400. So that became lecture classes, of course, but I was using teaching assistants to hold the seminars with them once a week. And I always took seminars as well, so I could gauge what the students were picking up and what they weren't. And so I became a TA for 1 hour, not 1 hour, one time a week, usually at least I took about 3 seminars. Also, I was mindful that the graduate students had a heavy load, especially in marking, and so I was happy to be able to lessen your load. Certainly at the graduate level, I ran seminars. I was always delighted to teach graduate students, because they had much more time to do the reading than I did. And so I learned so much from their reading and their summarizing what they had learned. I was not thrilled with the program in the Department of Anthropology, which still exists today in terms of pedagogy, and that PhD students can opt out of taking seminars and just work in tutorials with their professor. And I always tried to encourage students to do seminars, but when they insisted on these tutorials, I certainly had no choice but to go along. But again, as you've heard me say, I'm a firm believer in being able to in students participating in seminars, because they learn so much more from the other students. I think that they feel that they have to be on top of the game when they're presenting in front of other students. And there are cases definitely when students who were in tutorials would say, "Oh, I'm sorry I didn't get to do the readings, and can we postpone the meeting?" Whereas in seminars, they have to be there. So I was not thrilled, and I think it's a program that still continues at McGill, and I hope it changes. It's really the old British approach to studying, to doing anthropology, or to doing many fields. As well, if I'm asked to, as I was, what changes I made in pedagogy, well, I kind of took an early retirement at the time that the digitization was coming in. So I don't know, I would have changed certainly to keep up with the times in terms of using PowerPoint presentations and WebCT. But it was on the cusp of changing into the more technical form of teaching, technological form of teaching, that I did not really change very much my style of teaching, although I know I would have. I have since given lectures and taught many classes in various places, and I'm using PowerPoint. I'm not thrilled about it, but because I noticed that if you put up text, the students are so busy writing down the text that they don't pay attention to what you're saying. So I'm not sure quite how I would have modeled it when I was forced to do PowerPoint presentations. So I did have at McGill a number of PhD students and master's students. Some of the PhD students came from the history department, so I was always co-directing, and with either Louise Deschênes, I had the great fortune to be co-supervisor very early in my career at McGill with Louise Deschênes, and learned a lot about her rigorous approach to PhD theses. And I co-directed with Kate Deborah and the name will come back to me. Sorry, Pierre. And then, of course, I also had PhD theses in the department. Some of them were archaeology, some of them quite distant from my area of research. But that, of course, is what all teachers do, and I certainly learned a lot. My first doctoral thesis was Bill Wicken, who was the history student and the one that I co-directed with Louise Deschênes. Since he was the first one, I wasn't quite sure how I was supposed to operate in the tutorials. So I made a point of reading every book he was reading in order to be able to discuss it with him when he came. It was the worst period of my life because I was both, of course, teaching, doing my own research, had obligations at home, and I was reading these books as fast as Bill was. I quickly learned after that it wasn't really necessary. Better to ask the questions than to actually read the material, but it almost did me in. However, I also learned a lot. Bill Wicken was working on the Mi'kmaq populations of Nova Scotia, and he certainly continued doing his writing. A good number of the students, particularly the PhD students, have ended up in academia. And I'm always delighted when I go to a conference. I certainly attend the papers of former students. They didn't have to be directly my students, but students that I may have taught, or students certainly that I knew. I was graduate director for a number of years in the department, and I always go to hear their papers, and I'm always thrilled to hear what they're doing and to see what they're doing. And of course, thanks to email, I've kept up with a number of the students as well. So in terms of my career in ethnohistory, I have to say that if it were not for two people, I probably would have stayed on in doing the original plan, which was urban studies. And that was that I, of course, had no knowledge of the Hudson's Bay Company records at the time. And I met at a conference at the National Museum of Man in the early 1970s. The National Museum Man today is known as the Canadian Museum of History. I met Jim Chisen, who was an archaeologist who had done work at Lower Fort Garry. I'd actually met him one time when I was out there. This was in Manitoba. So he was well aware of the Hudson's Bay Company records, which had been transferred in 1967 from London to Manitoba as the gift of the Hudson's Bay Company to Canada's centennial. And so he told me about these records, which I then discovered were daily journals kept by the traders at each of the posts about the events at the post and the people coming in. And these journals were sent back to England every year. And as you may know, the Hudson's Bay Company started at Fort Rupert or Fort Rupert, today known as, no, it was Fort Charles, certainly. Then it became known as Fort Rupert, and today, and Rupert House, and today is known as Waskaganish. So Quebec plays a very central role in the start of the Hudson's Bay Company's move across the country and its involvement in the fur trade. So I discovered this vast collection of Hudson's Bay Company records, and knowing also that they were available up to 1870 at the they had been microfilmed and placed on deposit at the National Archives in Ottawa. I had scouted them out and knew it was a vast collection. So I went to the Ministère des Affaires Culturelles and saw Charles Martin, who then became a good friend. But he's the one who provided me with a grant to do the research, because I realized in order to do a proper research, I had to hire students. I could never, still be at it if I had to read all the records myself. And Charles Martin was not only supportive of me, but supportive of so many other people starting out in research, whether it was in archaeology or ethnohistory or field work, and we owe a lot to him. Now, as it happens, I don't know if Charles Martin had thought differently, but I might not have received this grant, because at the time he was awarding me the grant, he apparently received, and I do have a copy of that letter somewhere, received a letter from a few young anthropologists in Quebec. This was at the height, of course, the nationalist movement here, and they were objecting that he was giving money to to a student from Toronto. Well, of course, had already been a resident here for a number of years. I was a student. I was doing my PhD in Toronto, and that was the only connection to Toronto. Charles kind of just ignored it, and of course, I had the grant and was able to hire a few students. The person who was the most important of the students that I'd hired was Dan Francis. He had a master's. Before I go that, I must also say that as it happens, the Ministère des Affaires Culturelles, the Section de Patrimoine, or whatever it was called in those days, had realized that they had to do research on James Bay because the James Bay James Bay hydroelectric development was going to be going forward, it looked like. So they better have all this information at hand as before the places were flooded. So they were working in archaeology. They hired a francophone to do the research in the archives. This was before I approached Charles Martin. This person worked for a few weeks in the archives and found it too difficult. It gave him headaches to be able to decipher the handwriting and the language used in 18th century archives. So when I approached Charles, it was perfect because this person retired or withdrew from having to do it, and another reason I was receiving the grant. So the young people I hired, I did go to the University of, to Carleton University, spoke to the historians there, and I said I would like to hire a student to help me with this research, and Sid Wise, who was then the graduate director, said, well, if you want somebody who's just as likely to turn it into a play, then I would recommend Dan Francis. And so I did hire Dan. He and I worked along for the next few years, both doing the research, and then we decided to write the book Partners and in Furs together. And It's Easy Reading is really a tribute to his great talents as a writer. I'm happy to say that I gave him the start. He went on to become a very well-known Canadian historical writer and has written many, many books. And I was always delighted when students had to do some research and they were coming up with books by Dan Francis. I was always very pleased to see it. As for the discipline then of ethnohistory, this was just how I got started in ethnohistory. The discipline of ethnohistory, it's kind of hard to pin down. It combines the methodologies of history using the data that historians always have access to, which is, of course, recorded. And it takes also from anthropology, applying the logic of anthropology, the logic and structure, the cohesion that we learn about in a society, and applying it to the historical data. And it's to gain the knowledge of a pre-literate people. Of course, it doesn't have to be just Indians. It turns out that happens to be the Americans started working on Indian history after the Second World War, when the U.S. government was looking at returning or compensating people for the lands that had been taken from them, and who best to hire but anthropologists rather than historians, since it was anthropologists working with Indians. So this field started developing after the Second World War. But ethnohistory can also refer to African history, can refer to women's history, can refer to working class history, of course, any history of peoples who didn't make the recordings themselves. And the focus that I was interested in, and the focus in ethnohistory, is generally on the nature and causes of changes to the society, because if you're doing a study based on records, you're going to see the developments as chronologically these records continue. The field work, so was basically in the Hudson's Bay Company records, but I also was able, the field work that I did is I approached it, and I think I did a paper on it, doing field work in the archives, where I approach it as an anthropologist, looking at the material that I was learning about the Crees. Some of it was just spotty, so-and-so came in, they gave his name. Maybe the next year they would say, oh, they came in, but he brought his brother. And he would give the brother's name. And so I was able to build up profiles of individuals. And in my thesis, which was published by the National Museum, I do have these profiles of the hunters. And then we came across the Hudson's Bay Company traders talking about people that came in as the head of brigades. And these were during periods of competition when the French were competing with the fur trade to the south, and then the Northwest Company came in as a way of encouraging more development of furs coming in. They encouraged men to go out and to seek other from other groups. Trappers would bring in their furs, so sometimes brigades were coming in with a man at the head of it, bringing maybe 20 canoes of people with their furs. And so the Hudson's Bay Company, as the French before them, had designated them as trading captains and gave them sets of clothing with, I wish we had photographs, plumed hats, pumps referring to the shoes, coats with shiny buttons. That would be wonderful. And I know from the Cree's oral tradition that the Cree leaders would change their clothes at a creek a few kilometers from, say, Waskaganish. And this creek even today is known as Dress Up Creek. And that was when they would change into their uniforms before they approached the post, because they were the leaders. And there were also lieutenants who also received coats, but with less designation, with less status. You've asked me about my writing. Just very quickly, I'll say, well, it doesn't come that easily to me, but I tend to be distracted by day. So I tend to write at night and when the house is quiet, when there's less distractions, of course, although the internet has interfered with that. In the old days, it was you couldn't telephone a friend at night, and so I tend to do my best writing at night. I wish I had a poetic nature. It's not a talent that I have. I would like to make the writing flow a little more easily, but fortunately, at times when I do books, I have editors that help, and I just write as I try to tell a story, but I'm not a gifted storyteller, and I'm in awe of those who are.